In October 2021, CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced he was changing Facebook's name to Meta and expanding its borders into the metaverse.
What is the metaverse?
Metaverse.
In the metaverse.
The metaverse will be the successor to the mobile internet.
The company promises a new reality, full of avatars and futuristic worlds.
Today, we're going to talk about the metaverse.
When technology progresses, it just seems to get more and more confusing. We're all familiar with Facebook, but how does anyone even explain the concept of an extended reality? Throughout history, we've done a pretty good job at creating more and more engaging mediums. We've gone from reading books to watching TikTok. We've gone from chess to video games to virtual reality. We have more ways to connect with people than ever before. But what do any of these things mean for the human experience? If networks are being used to improve communication, is it being leveraged for good or for bad? Are these systems bringing people together as communication was intended, or are we leveraging these systems to benefit the wrong people? Before we get into any of this, we actually need to step back and review some of the innovations that brought us here in the first place. The earliest forms of communication involved optical systems. Basically, this means that people used whatever visual cues they could signal in order to communicate information across distance. Some of the earliest examples of this include like bonfires from the Roman Empire, physical flags held by hand, or even flags held by a maritime vessel. While these systems were primitive, because their primary limitation was visibility by the naked eye, there's some further improvements that were made later in the 1790s. In 1794, Frenchman Claude Chappe implemented an optical telegraph system using mechanical parts. Chappe labeled his invention as the tachograph. The way this system worked was by establishing a network of towers within visible distance of one another. Mechanical parts were able to signal messages, which would get relayed to the adjacent tower, who just ends up repeating the same message to the next tower, kind of like a relay. The system was impressive at the time because it was able to send messages upwards of 350 miles per hour. France was given a huge military advantage, and this system is one of the earliest forms of what we could possibly call a communication network. Further innovations inspired electronic communications as we know it. In 1799, Alessandro Volta created the first battery, which happened to be 1,000 times stronger than rubbing amber. In 1825, William Sturgeon figured out how to lift a 9-pound weight using a battery to generate the force. But linking this all to communications, Joseph Henry was able to demonstrate the possibility of telegraph technology by conducting a simple experiment. He strung a mile of wire around the walls of his classroom. At one end he placed a battery, at the other end he connected an electromagnet, a pivoting metal bar, and a bell. When Henry connected the battery, the electromagnetic attracted the metal bar, causing it to ring the bell. Back on the home frontier, a lot of pissed off Americans were demanding to have their own telegraph system, just like the Europeans. In 1837, there were several proposals to form a telegraph system, most of which were optical. Samuel Morse had a different idea though. He had been working on a system that could send electrical signals over wires. After demonstration, his project was approved in 1843. Congress approved a $30,000 project for the construction of a 40-mile telegraph line between D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland. On May 1st, 1844, after Henry Clay was nominated for president, a courier hand-carried a message about the news to the Annapolis Junction, where the message was telegraphed to Washington. This was the first news reported via telegraph. The systems became prominent in the following decades as they eventually replaced the Pony Express in 1861. But all in all, the telegraph system became obsolete when they were replaced by telephones in 1877. The biggest problem with telegraphs was that a single wire was limited to just one message. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, proposed the idea of a harmonic message, or the musical telegraph. He implemented this for human speech, creating the telephone in 1876. The telephone was a rapidly growing technology, first taking precedent in commercial establishments. By the 1890s, they had expanded to everyday households, breaking boundaries of home life and work life. Interpersonal dynamics took a turn as well. After the telephone's invention, Governor Chauncey of New York was receiving unwanted phone calls from ordinary citizens, telling him how great his speech was or what a fine letter he wrote. Aside from other privacy issues like telephone eavesdropping, the arrival of the telephone raises some ethical questions about technology. So my question to you is, knowing that some innovations in telecommunication has kind of changed our dynamic towards human relationships, how does technology affect our relationship with people in positions of power or affluence? Is it favorable to have a connection with these people, or could there be some negative consequences with enabling this in the first place? The first telewriter wasn't popular, but Mark Twain did write Tom Sawyer with it. In 1890, more reliable models were produced, making it more common in the office. The teletype was popularized when it was able to send a message over a telegraph line. Electromagnets in the telegraph were all innovations led by Ørsted, Sturgeon, and Henry. The relationship between electricity and magnetism was seemingly mysterious at the time, until James Clerk Maxwell came along. In 1864, he published A Dynamical Theory of the Electromagnetic Field. In 1885, Heinrich Hertz followed up his work by generating electromagnetic waves, proving the validity of Maxwell's theory. The first radio signals were generated by Guglielmo Marconi in 1895. He founded the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company in England. Radio, or wireless telegraphs, was a superior method of transmitting messages until television took over. One of the earliest experiments with television started with Paul Nipkow's invention of the Nipkow disc. This laid the early foundations of television. It wasn't until 1927 when Phileo Farnsworth was able to construct the first electronic television transmission. The idea was introduced to millions of Americans during New York City's World Fair. The earliest televisions would cost about the same as an automobile, making them a rarity in common households. Adoption of the television took off during the 1950s when prices fell drastically. Television was a big deal. The 1969 moon landing was one of the biggest television events in history, demonstrating a comprehensive ability to leverage technology for the benefit of mankind. Television, like other mediums of communication, changed our interaction with news sources. Centralized news sources became sources of political polarization, feeding into the news junkie groups. Various news organizations compete for the flow of information, relying on computer technology to stay on top of trends. Mistakes were not unheard of. Examples of this include the 2000 election with Al Gore and George W. Bush. So leading into this, given that technology and television and all these communication mediums, they provide easy sources of information. So given that, how do we evaluate the potential for false information? Should we trust the entities delivering news, or should we take it with a grain of salt first and be willing to fact check whatever information we hear? This question becomes even more relevant as we explore social media platforms, where false information is often exacerbated. Remote computing took off with George Stibitz's invention of the complex electromechanical number adder. This was improved with telecommunications by using the teletype as an I/O device. Also, during this time, labor demands within technology grew, bringing women into the workforce. Rising tensions with the Soviet Union instigated the creation of ARPANET, the first network of computers. The security innovation here was packet switching, a method to keep the network of computers secure and decentralized. ARPANET was actually the precursor to the internet as we know it. ARPANET was vastly improved with the emergence of new peer-to-peer electronic communications. Gigastud Ray Tomlinson invented email for the ARPANET computers in 1972. Innovations were made by Lawrence Roberts, making it one of the most widespread telecommunication mediums. ARPANET was mostly a network for research computers. Robert Kahn and Vincent Cerf evolved the network to the internet by implementing the TCP/IP, which is just Internet Protocol Suite. NSFNet formed in 1986 to reserve a network for some part of the academic community. It ceased funding in 1995 and eventually integrated with the internet. Broadband simply refers to a high-speed internet connection. This enabled large transfer of data files, and it vastly improved adoption of the internet. Wireless networks are a contemporary technology we're more familiar with. After Motorola demonstrated radio waves on cell phones in 1973, Henry Yoden proposed creating hotspots, or wireless internet access points. These eventually composed the Wi-Fi networks as we know them today. Now that we've reviewed some of the networking history, we should refer back to my two original questions. How does technology affect our relationship with powerful, affluent individuals, especially social media figures? And also, how do you evaluate an individual's credibility over the internet? Technology often raises questions regarding regulation. We should address some of the events happening within the decentralized finance sphere of the cryptocurrency. According to Coindesk.com, $2.8 billion were lost in rug pull scams. In 2021, 37% of scam revenue came from this category. Rug pulls are an act of deception by a token holder in order to seize liquidity from an asset. Essentially, the investors who are persuaded into a project end up with their money stolen. The following clip you're about to watch is a case study from early February, where a popular online YouTuber was questioned about his rug pull, stealing over $400,000 from his loyal social media supporters.
If you want the answer, yeah, I could give the money back. It is within my power. But I'm going to look out for myself and not do that. I don't know what else to say. That's just the most honest answer.
Do the opposite. I don't know how this could, how you could not see this as a total scam. This was a scam. You said something, it wasn't delivered, and then you took the money. That's a scam.
I mean, if that's what you want, if that's how you want to label it, then sure.
To address the question of regulation, a utilitarian could easily argue that the sum of negatives is greater than the sum of positives, given the prevalence of scams. This is a common and reasonable argument to take, given the collateral damage of various scams. I personally will make the case that decentralized finance ought to stay deregulated. The goal of this technology is to eliminate human entities and promote the utilization of smart contracts. Don't get me wrong, the strong presence of scams within the DeFi sphere is terrible, and it tarnishes the reputation of the technology. I believe the best way to move forward with this type of technology is to educate, rather than regulate. The technology is here to stay. There is no sense in trying to beat it down. If we could approve these projects with an open mind, there would be much less turmoil in growing the relevant technologies and their adoption.